I started watching BookTube nearly 9 years ago, and I started making BookTube videos nearly 8 years ago. That's kind of a long time, and in that time, my reading tastes have changed a bit. So in this at least 3-part video series, I'm going to be seeing how much it's changed. In this video, I'm going to be rereading books that I did not like the first time that I read them, but I think I might like them now. And in the next couple of videos in the series, I'm going to be rereading old favorites to see, do they hold up? But for now, let's focus on the task at hand, books I didn't like the first time, or at least thought were mediocre. This video in the series is actually largely inspired by the Monster manga series. I read the first few volumes of the series in 2016 and wasn't super impressed with them. I thought they were just mediocre, and I set the series down. But in the following years, that genre of like psychological mysteries and thrillers really started growing on me, and I decided to give the series a second chance last year. And I went on to read the entire series last year, and I really enjoyed it, and it's become one of my favorite series. And because of how much I enjoyed Monster, I ended up picking up one of Urasawa's other series, 20th Century Boys, which is on track to possibly be my new favorite manga series, possibly even more than Death Note, which I didn't think was possible. So that just got me wondering, are there other books that I read in the past that I thought were just mediocre at the time or didn't like, but I would actually really like them now if I read them? What books are maybe more in line with my taste in books now than they were at the time I read them? And if I reread them now, would the same thing happen with them that happened with Monster? Because sure, reading tastes change, and I'm definitely gravitating toward much different books than I was in 2014 when I joined BookTube. In 2014 and 2015, fantasy and dystopia, and especially the combination of the two, were my absolute favorite genres. But now I'm much more likely to pick up a murder mystery or something psychological, or a death game is one of my favorite things. 2015 was when I picked up my first ever comic series, and now in 2022, the vast majority of stuff I've read this year I think has been manga. But just because I'm gravitating toward different genres now and picking up different books now than I would in the past, does that necessarily mean that I would like a book more or less now than I did back then? Because it's not like I dislike the genres I used to read. I still enjoy fantasy and dystopia, I just don't read them as much as I used to, and I don't consider them my favorite genres anymore. So does that shift in favorite genres and what I gravitate toward also indicate a shift in what books I would and would not like? I don't know, we'll see. So I'm gonna go ahead and run through the books that I've chosen for this video and give a very, very brief explanation as to why I'm reading them for this. And then when I actually reread them, I'll go into a lot more detail as to why I didn't like it the first time, why I'm reading it for this, all that good stuff. First up, the Lock and Key comic series. This was the aforementioned first comic series I ever read, so I don't think I fully understood the genre. And also, I went into this expecting something other than what it was, and it ended up being a little too weird for my taste. Also, there's a Netflix show, I think, and I've never checked it out even though I've read this entire series, so I might do that at some point in this video, we'll see. Another with a Netflix adaptation, the first volume of The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. I don't remember a lot about this, but like with Lock and Key, this was just way too weird for my reading taste at the time that I read it. I like weird now, so I want to give it another chance. Another that falls within that same weird realm is Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore. Also, like with Lock and Key, I went into this with certain expectations about what this story was going to be, and it was nothing like I expected. Now that I know what to expect and like weird stuff, I have high hopes for this one. Last comic on this list, this is the Fade Out Volume 1. A lot of these seem to relate back to Lock and Key, but like with Lock and Key, this was also one of the earliest comics that I read, so I still wasn't really used to the format, and I think that gave me a skewed perception of what to expect. And finally, the one book that is kind of out in left field for this video, that is A Separate Piece by John Knowles. I honestly didn't really give myself a chance to enjoy the books that I had to read for English class in high school, and in my mind this has always had that kind of like Dead Poets Society, dark academia vibe to it, and now that that's something I really love in books, I think I might actually enjoy this. Future Kristen popping in to say that I'm also adding one more book to the TBR, and that is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. This book is actually a little bit different from the rest on this list in the fact that I don't think I'm going to like this one upon a reread. However, I also kind of still wonder if I've been a little bit harsh to it over the years, and I want to test that theory. So not a huge TBR for this video, but it's been a long time since I've done a book video and I kind of miss it. And I haven't done as much rereading within the past several years, which I've really missed because I love rereading books. Enough intro, let's jump into the clips of me reading these books and seeing if I like them more this time. So I'm feeling a bit under the weather today, and since I'm gonna be just at home not feeling like doing anything, I figured I'd just go ahead and pick up a book for this video, and that's gonna be The Fade Out Volume 1. This is one where I have a very clear memory of when I got it and when I read it, because I got it over the summer of 2015 when I was on a book buying ban, but I bought this the week of my birthday as kind of like a present to myself for sticking to my book buying ban up until that point. And I read it immediately because it was one of the books that was like at the very top of my TBR. Firstly, because the second I saw this cover, I was in love. This is still one of my favorite covers of any book ever. I think it's just really stunning, but also the premise did really intrigue me. This is one where I don't really remember anything that happens in this. I just remember the premise. This takes place in the 1940s in like Hollywood. It's got like a film noir type vibe, and it deals with, I believe, the murder of an up-and-coming Hollywood starlet. That's literally all I can tell you about this. So this is what I had to say about it right after I read it. And I thought that this was just all right. I feel like it's an interesting start to a series, but it almost feels like reading chapter 1 of like a 50 chapter book. It just felt kind of incomplete. So at the time that I read this, I gave it 3 out of 5, which now with my current rating system would be a 2 out of 5. It was okay. It was all right. I didn't have strong opinions on this. It was mostly just a disappointment because I was so hyped up about it because the premise sounded great and I was obsessed with the cover, and it just didn't live up to anything that I hoped it would be. So there are 2 main reasons that I decided to give this a second chance. Firstly, it's a murder mystery, plain and simple. I love murder mysteries. I'm definitely willing to give it a second chance just on that basis. Secondly, and this will probably be a recurring theme in this video, but this was one of the earliest books I read in a graphic format. The Lock and Key series, which you'll see later in this video, were the first books that I ever read in any form of graphic format, whether comic, graphic novel, or manga. And I read this only a couple of months after reading Lock and Key, so this was still a very new format for me that I was still trying to kind of find my footing with. And I think that becomes very apparent when you listen to me talk about my feelings about this first volume. I think my biggest complaint with this first volume was that I didn't get enough story there. It didn't feel very complete. I think I was expecting volume 1 of a comic series to read the same and have the same pacing as book 1 in any other novel book series, and that's just simply not the case with most books in a graphic format. So now that I'm more familiar with this format and with storytelling in graphic novels and comics, will I enjoy this more this time around? I kind of think this might be either a love it or hate it situation, because one of the things that kind of has me a little worried about enjoying it upon a reread is that it is historical fiction. Historically, I don't always have the best relationship with historical fiction because old-fashioned speech isn't something I really love reading. But then again, nothing I said in 2015 was particularly negative. I just really hyped myself up and it didn't live up to that expectation, and it was just okay. So hopefully I'll enjoy it more this time. You know what? I should have known better. Anytime a book is described as love it or hate it, I end up having a completely middle of the road opinion, and I just went and did it to myself thinking I would love it or hate it, and I once again have a completely middle of the road opinion on this. This was fine. I'll bump it up like 0.5 stars from where I previously had it rated. It's like a 2.5 out of 5, right smack dab in the middle. So in this story, we're following a screenwriter named Charlie who wakes up one morning in the house of the star of the movie that he's working on, and she is across the room, dead, strangled to death. He doesn't remember the night before. They went to a party and were totally blacked out, and he's freaked out from all this, so he flees the scene without telling anyone he was there or what he saw. When he gets news about her death later that day, there's been a bit of a cover-up. The scene has been changed to make it look like she unalived herself. So now he knows that something shady's going on top of the fact that someone murdered her. I will stand by what I said 7 years ago in the fact that this does not feel like it should be the first volume of a 3-volume series. This feels like it should be the first volume of like a 10, 15, who knows how long series. The pacing in this and the way everything was set up made it feel like the setup to a much longer series, not act 1 of a 3-act movie, if that makes sense. So I'm wondering how everything's going to be wrapped up within just 3 volumes. Also, every time I talk about why I don't love historical fiction, I always reference old-fashioned speech, which is definitely one reason why I dislike it. But rereading this just reminded me of another one that I always forget to mention, and that's just like the whole gender dynamic that's at play in any historical fiction ever. The imbalance of power between the genders, the way women are talked about and talked to, the way they're objectified, it just is kind of always present in historical fiction, whether it's overt or whether it's not. And I just never want to read about that. So overall, like I said, 2.5 out of 5, it was all right. I think if this were much longer than 3 volumes, I would say I'm absolutely not finishing this series. But since it is so short, I think I might be intrigued just enough to finish it up and see what happens. Don't hold me to that though. I might change my mind in like 5 minutes.
So today I'm going to be rereading the first volume of Sandman by Neil Gaiman. I first read this in early 2016 because Jeff from Ermagerd Books was really hyping it up, and at the time he was my most trusted reviewer on BookTube. This was still at the point when like fantasy was still my favorite genre, and although Jeff and I didn't have identical taste in books by any means, if he really hyped up a fantasy and gave it 5 stars out of 5, I almost always loved it as well. At the time, I gave this 3 stars out of 5, which now with my current rating system would be a 2 out of 5. It was okay. Genuinely, I couldn't tell you a single thing about the story. I don't remember the premise at all. All I remember is that I thought it was kind of weird, and at the time, weird wasn't really my thing. But I'm rereading it now because now within my reading there's like a whole section of books that I read that I just define as weird stuff happens. Haruki Murakami, one of my favorite authors now. All of his like surrealist stuff I would put in that category of just, I don't know, weird stuff happens. I don't know how else to describe this premise. Like in one of my favorite novels by him, fish rain down from the sky and there's a man who just speaks to cats. I don't know, man, weird stuff happens. I'd also put House of Leaves in that category. Like technically, yes, it's horror, but weird stuff happens. I don't know how to describe it. So I think this will be more in line with my taste now than 2016. That said, of the ones I'm rereading, this is probably the one I'm most skeptical that I'm going to enjoy. Partially because one, like I said, I don't remember this premise at all. Have no idea what this is about. But secondly, this is also fantasy. And as much as I loved fantasy back then, I have not picked up a fantasy novel in a very long time. It's just not something I've really grabbed for quite a while now. I'm just never in the mood for fantasy anymore. So I think that if I end up not enjoying this, it will actually be for the opposite reason as in 2016. It'll be because I didn't want the fantasy, but I liked the weird stuff. Also, apparently recently this was adapted into a Netflix show, and my favorite podcaster, Taryn Armstrong, has been hyping up both the comic series and the show, so I'm intrigued. I'll check it out. It's been 6 years and clearly nothing has changed. I'm still out here just blindly trusting my favorite creators' recommendations. This one I have really weird opinions on. I thought that this was a really well-constructed, very intricate, very interesting and creative comic that is the good kind of weird. But I also thought that it wasn't quite my thing. I found myself thinking that this comic was good and I even liked it, but I found myself really not wanting to be reading it. So overall, I think that this is a really good comic, and if this is your thing, I think you'll really like it. But there was some sort of disconnect with me that just made me not want to read it anymore. She hit the nail on the head. You could have given me this and told me to read it without telling me what it was and convinced me that I've never read it before in my life, because not a single thing about this was familiar at all. And yet somehow I still managed to have almost the exact same opinion that I had 6 years ago. So the premise of this, which I couldn't have told you about an hour and a half ago, is that we are following Morpheus, the god of dreams, who has been imprisoned and now is trying to regain his power and rebuild his kingdom. Side note, a premise that I would never pick up now, by the way. Like I said in my last review, I don't know how to describe my feelings about this except that it is definitely not my thing. Like, I think this is complex and well written and genuinely a good comic, but I didn't really like it. I didn't enjoy my time reading it. Honestly, I mostly didn't want to be reading this. Like, I really just don't know how to describe my feelings about this because I don't think it's bad. I just didn't like it. Definitely weird. I will give it that. But somehow not my type of weird that I enjoy. I think my rating stands. I think I would still give this like 2 out of 5. I can acknowledge that it's good, but I didn't like it. I don't know, this is just a weird reading experience to try to explain. As you can see behind me, I have just finished watching the first episode of Sandman, and honestly, I really enjoyed that. It covered very little of the first volume. I think that this first season of the show covers the first 2 volumes of the comic, but I had a really great time watching that, and I think I'm gonna continue the show. They showed a preview at the end of the episode for like what's to come this season. I'm intrigued. I want to see more. The rare times I have preferred an adaptation to the source material, it's because I've watched the adaptation before reading the book that it was adapted from. But I think this is my first time watching an adaptation of a book I didn't enjoy, and I'm enjoying this experience quite a bit. Maybe it's just a story that works better for me personally in the visual form. Maybe it's just like the whole vibe and aesthetic going on with the show versus the comic. I don't know, but I'm having a good time. I'm also going to be watching the first episode of Lock and Key for this video, which is what I'm about to do next. So I probably won't continue Sandman immediately. I'll probably want to watch Lock and Key more than it, but never say never. Given how much I enjoyed that first episode, it might totally blow Lock and Key out of the water. So next up, because it feels like the natural follow-up to Sandman, is Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloan, which probably is a very odd statement to anyone but me, but allow me to explain. So firstly, all those descriptors that I talked about when talking about what I thought Sandman was going to be like, you know, the Murakami comparison, House of Leaves, all that stuff, that really didn't end up applying to Sandman. Like I said, I remembered nothing about it except that it was weird, but it definitely does apply and is a good comparison to Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, which I'll go into more detail about in a minute, but also just secondly because this is the book on this list that I'm most optimistic about enjoying this time around, and after reading Sandman, I kind of need that. So let's pop back to past Kristen again, where I was talking about this in a book unhaul. So next I have Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore by Robin Sloan. This was very different from what I expected, and it got really weird and not necessarily in a good way. Not in a bad way either, but like just weird. It was okay. I didn't really dislike it, but I didn't really like it either. I'm not sure really how to put my feelings for this book into words. I'm never gonna reread it, so why keep it? So I lied twice in that clip actually. Firstly, I never ended up unhauling this. This is the same exact copy. I think I just put it in a box and sent it to my parents' house. But also secondly, I said I was never going to reread this, and here we are. So when I read this, and currently as it sits on my Goodreads, I gave this 3 out of 5. However, that unhaul was less than a year after I'd read it, and hearing myself talk about it, that's much more in line with what I would give a 2.5 now out of 5. So that I think is what I'm going to take as my current before reading rating, because 2.5 out of 5 for me currently is just, it was all right, it was okay, and that was something I said multiple times in the unhaul. So unlike Sandman, I do remember some vague information about this. Vague, but it's information. I have a very clear memory of when I read it because I read it in August 2014, immediately after reading Ready Player One, which you're actually gonna see in the companion video to this, where I reread past favorites to see if they hold up, because I'm not sure. Basically, I just read one of my new all-time favorite books, and this as a follow-up was not what I wanted it to be. This book was super popular in 2014, and I just kind of expected it to be a traditional mystery set in a bookstore, which sounded ideal, but that's not exactly what this is. At the time, this was just too weird for my taste, and also I went into it with false expectations about what it would be, so I wasn't really even in the right mindset for this to be the type of weird that it was. But now that I know what I'm getting myself into, and also am much more inclined to pick up weird stories like this, I think that I could really enjoy this time around. In particular, I remember this being very similar both in like story and in tone to these podcasts by Public Radio Alliance that I reference a lot on my channel. They're all fictional serialized podcasts that are all just a little weird. One of their podcasts, Tanis, I think takes a lot of inspiration from House of Leaves. I read the book after listening to the podcast and I felt a lot of similarities there. They also have a podcast called Rabbits that inspired a book of the same name by the podcast creator Terry Miles. And based on my memory of this book, I think Rabbits takes a lot of inspiration from it. I could be totally off base here. As the name implies, Rabbits deals a lot with like going down the rabbit hole and like trying to follow these patterns in like a pseudo game. And I think a lot of this is like falling down the rabbit hole of research, trying to solve this conspiracy theory puzzle thing. Very convoluted way to describe both of these books, but that's the best I've got. And once again, we've got Haruki Murakami in this same realm, who is actually name dropped on the inside flap of this book, so I know it's accurate this time. And that's why this is the one I'm most optimistic about, because it seems to have both inspired and been inspired by media that I'm confident I enjoy. So I think maybe this reading experience will go better this second time now that I know what I'm in for. So I'm back after finishing my reread of Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, and I thankfully this time feel very vindicated by everything that I said before rereading this. First, I have a passage to read because it's just too perfect. I show him what I've added to the shelves. Stevenson, Murakami, the latest Gibson, The Information, House of Leaves, fresh editions of Moffat. I hit the nail on the head. Murakami and House of Leaves were the two main things that I referenced before rereading this, and they were name dropped in the same sentence in this book, which just like, I feel very vindicated here. Also, I will stand by the comparison that I made before rereading this book. If you liked Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, I would recommend Rabbits by Terry Miles. And like I said, the Public Radio Alliance podcasts that Terry Miles created, such as Rabbits and Tanis. I will say, between Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore and Rabbits, I did give this a 3.5 out of 5, and upon a reread, this is a 4 out of 5. So I do think I actually prefer this one over Rabbits, but they're both good. I liked both of them, and they're definitely comparable titles. I will say, I feel like I'm overutilizing the word weird when describing some of these stories. It definitely fits for some of the stuff I have described: House of Leaves, Rabbits, Tanis, probably Murakami as well. This, I think, is on the least weird part of the spectrum. Like, it's a little weird, but I'd probably call it more quirky than anything else. Like, this has a very specific tone, and it's a tone that exists in other stories that I've consumed, but it's not one that's easily labeled with a genre. In my review of Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, I described the genre as 20-something, vaguely pretentious, pseudo-lit-fic hipster fiction. I don't know if that makes any sense to anyone but me, but that is how I feel about this type of story. I think just in a way, there's this very like early 2010s hipstery vibe to it, and it sometimes feels like it's trying too hard to be a grander story than it actually is. All that said though, I am in fact a 20-something, try-hard, vaguely pretentious, pseudo-lit fic hipster. So I actually really enjoyed this reread. My previous rating was 2.5 out of 5, and after a reread, I gave this 4 out of 5. I really enjoyed it. Going into it knowing what to expect, knowing what type of story it was, I think really made a difference for me. There are certainly things in here that I don't absolutely love. There are elements to it that feel a little bit generic or tropey, and there are times when, even for me, it does lean a little bit too far into that like early 2010s hipstery vibe. But overall, I had a great time rereading this, and I really enjoyed it this time around. And also, I'm just kind of glad that I was right. The comparisons that I made fit, and I did enjoy it a lot more this time, like I thought I would. It just makes me feel like I do genuinely understand my taste in books better now. So after recording the intro to this video, I decided I wanted to read this last because of how many ways it links up to most of the other books that I'm reading for this vlog. Like I said in the intro and when talking about the Fade Out, Lock and Key was the first series I ever read in a graphic format, whether that be graphic novel, manga, comic. This was the first. And like with The Fade Out, which I read soon after this, I think I just wasn't really in the right mindset for this format. And like with The Fade Out, I think I went into this first volume in the series expecting the pacing of a first book in a series, and that's not necessarily how volumes in comic series work. Also, like with Sandman, in my memory, this was a lot weirder than I was expecting it to be, and at the time, weird books were not necessarily my thing. And I think most importantly, much like Mr. Penumbra's 24-hour bookstore, I went into this with a very different expectation of what it would be. Essentially, I went into this expecting paranormal activity. I expected a haunted house, ghosts, that kind of stuff. And as I said at the time, that's not what this is. In my actual memory of this, I would say this is much more along the lines of something like The Shining or American Horror Story Murder House, the first season. Those two, I think, are much better touch points for this than paranormal activity or like some ghost haunted house story. So basically, take every reason I've mentioned up to this point as to why I wanted to reread the other books I've reread so far and just apply all of them to this because it kind of fits all of those. However, I also find it interesting that my memory has actually not been as kind to this series as I was when I first read it. Watching back my videos from when I first read this series, I actually spoke about it fairly positively. I gave the series overall 4 stars, which now would be a 3-star with my current rating system. I've said this many times. And I think this first volume was actually one of my favorites in the series. I think at the time I was really trying to convince myself that I really enjoyed graphic novels and wanted to read them. And so I think I was kinder to this than I otherwise would have been. Lock and Key is the first graphic novel series that I've ever read, and when I first got into it, I wasn't so sure about graphic novels. I didn't know if I would really want to continue to read graphic novels, but now that I've read this, I really enjoy this form of storytelling, and I definitely want to get into some other graphic novels and see if I enjoy them. I definitely wouldn't say that I'm a complete graphic novel convert, but this has definitely shown me that I need to give graphic novels a chance. And also, I think that my memory of how much I enjoyed this has deteriorated over time, which is something that tends to happen a lot because I think I trust my ratings less and less as time goes on, especially one this old, and do have a tendency of lowering ratings after a while if I feel like I gave it too high of a rating at first. Because I read this in early 2015, and that was when I was still, I think, a lot more positive of a reviewer. Like, I doled out 4 stars like they were candy. If I so much as liked a book, they often got at least 4 stars. Versus my current rating system, which now liking a book gets 3 stars. And because of that shift and because of my lack of trust in my old ratings, I find myself often lowering ratings on books I read a long time ago if whatever rating I have on Goodreads doesn't match my memory of it or how I currently think about it, if that makes sense. And that's definitely the case for this. I think in my memory, this is a low 3 out of 5 read, if not a 2.5 out of 5. However, when I first read it, I gave it 4 stars because at the time I handed out positive reviews more frequently, even if I just liked a book. I hope all of that makes sense. Either way, here's what I had to say about it at the time. I did find some problems with the way things were explained and the rate at which things were explained, because there were things that happened that seemed out of place and confusing at the time that I actually read it, especially once I got into volumes 3 and 4, because I felt like I still didn't understand some things that were really important, such as the motive of the villain. I did think that some of this was slightly confusing, which is why it didn't get a higher star rating. From my memory, the premise of this is that this family moves into this old family estate, and the keys in this house do weird things. I want to say that the main antagonist of this series is some sort of entity that's attached to the house that presents as a human for some reason. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Everyone thinks it's an actual human, but it's not. And that's about all I remember about this series. So that's enough rambling about this. Let's jump into the reread. If I've learned anything about myself from doing this video, it's 1, how low my tolerance level was for anything weird. And then 2, just how low the bar actually was for me to use the word weird to describe something. Because I'm not sure that in 2022, I would ever really refer to this as weird. I mean, it's certainly a unique story, don't get me wrong,
but I used to just use the word weird to describe like everything. So what is this about? I was pretty spot on with the premise here. After their father's murder, a family moves across the country to live in his old family estate with their uncle, and it quickly becomes apparent that there are some weird things happening at this house. And one of those weird things is this like humanoid being that is attached to the house. So I had a pretty good memory of what the premise of this was. So I think I said earlier that although my original rating was 4 out of 5, before rereading it, it was actually more like a 3 out of 5 with my current rating scale. And I think I will still say that it is a 3 out of 5 for me, but I also think my opinion on this has gone up a bit, and I don't know how to make that make sense. Maybe my previous rating was more like a 2.5 than a 3 because my opinion on it kind of was non-existent anymore. I kind of felt like it was just fine, whereas now I feel like I can more definitively say I like it. So that's kind of how I'm feeling now that I have reread it, and I'm like, it's a 3, but I feel more positive about it now than I did before rereading that. After rereading this, I will also say I think I would have more positive opinions on the series overall if I reread the entire series. That said, rereading this does not give me the strongest urge to just go out and reread the rest of the series, and I don't think I will. But I do feel like I'm coming out of this with more positive opinions on this volume and the series as a whole than what I remembered having before. So that's a positive, I guess. I think I even more so now want to check out the Netflix adaptation than I did before. I'm also starting to wonder if this video was a total bust, because so far I've read 4 of the 5 books and have come away from 3 of them with almost the exact same opinion that I had before. Maybe my opinions haven't changed as much over the past 7 years as I thought they did.
So I'm back after finishing the first episode of Lock and Key. So honestly, it's kind of hard to say how much of the first volume of Lock and Key this first episode covered because it deviated so far from the comic. All kinds of stuff happened in it that I know didn't happen in volume 1, and I don't remember happening elsewhere in the series. I think technically this episode covers maybe like 2/3 of the first volume of the comic, which is weird to me because the show has 3 seasons and we've already gotten at least seemingly a decent way through the first volume of 6. So we're really deviating from the source material in the show, which is I think why I don't like it so much, because there was a lot of focus on like teen drama in this first episode, and I don't often like that. I don't often enjoy teen drama in my shows unless they're explicitly supposed to be about teen drama, which this is not. Maybe some of this stuff that happened in this episode happens later in the series and I just don't remember it because it's been 7 years, but this was just a wild deviation. So yeah, absolutely opposite of what I expected. I did not enjoy the first episode of Lock and Key as much as I enjoyed the first episode of Sandman.
Let's chat about A Separate Piece by John Knowles. As I mentioned, it has been the longest since I read this. I read this as a freshman in high school as required reading for my English class. Although, let's be honest, did I even really read it? I could probably count on one hand the number of times I actually finished a required reading book for English class. I was able to get by via our discussions that we had in class because we talked about all the books in class and then just like spark notesing everything else. Like I literally read page 1 of Heart of Darkness, said no thank you, and got by during that unit just based on in-class discussion. Anyway, I think I actually made it a pretty decent way through this one. How far? Not sure, but I think effort was made. And then recently, completely unprompted, completely separate from this video, I thought about it and I was like, you know what? I might enjoy that now in hindsight. Let me pick it up and give it a reread. And then when I went to grab books for this video, I saw it on my shelf and I was like, oh, hey, that's exactly why I bought this book. Let's add it to the video. I don't think I had a clear reason for disliking this when we read it for class. I think I was just kind of in that phase where I disliked everything I was forced to read for English class. I mean, despite not finishing most of the books for English, I do have a long list of books I did not like because I had to read them for English class. I also remember for some reason this being one of the books that was like overwhelmingly disliked by my classmates. So that was probably a pretty big influence as well, given that I probably didn't finish it. However, in the 13 to 14 years it's been since I read this, My mind always links this with Dead Poets Society. It's a coming of age story at a boys' boarding school. I think some dark things happen in this if I remember correctly. Like, I feel like I remember something bad happening in this that had to do with like a football and or a tree, maybe separate incidents. I don't know. I'm not sure if someone who has actually read this and knows what they're talking about would put this in like the dark academia realm, but because of the way that I think about it and how my brain links it to Dead Poet Society, I put it in that realm, which makes me think I will like it upon a reread. I don't think I have a starting rating for this one because, of course, I didn't finish it. And also, I don't think I've rated it on Goodreads either. But I think if I were to take my opinion of it that I've had over the years and give it a star rating, I think we're starting out in the vicinity of like a 1.5 out of 5, because for the better part of like 14 years, I have considered this a book that I dislike. And with my current rating scale, anything in the realm of dislike gets 1 star on Goodreads, whether that's a 0.5, a 1, or a 1.5. So I would say this is probably currently a 1.5. I disliked this book when I read it, but I don't have particularly strong feelings about that dislike. I just didn't like it. I think I just got like a flash of a memory of like the climax of this book. And I think, spoiler alert, I think you can add stairs to the previous list of bad things. Something with the football, something with the tree, and something with a set of stairs. As for how I think this is gonna go, I honestly don't know. I don't want to make the same mistake I did earlier in the video and be like, I think I'm gonna love it or hate it. But I think that is kind of a distinct possibility. Like, I feel like this is either going to be really dated and have a bunch of stuff in it that I don't like or want to read, or it's going to match the vibe that I keep mentally attaching it to, and therefore I will really enjoy it. So now that I said that, I'm probably gonna be completely middle of the road on this. So I wouldn't say I ended up having a middle of the road opinion on this, but it also wasn't the total love it or hate it that I thought it might end up being. I quite definitively liked this. I would say my rating for this is either a 3 or a 3.5. I think right now I'm leaning toward a 3.5, but I might change my mind in like 5 minutes. So this is a coming of age novel that takes place at an all-boys boarding school in the 1940s in the middle of World War II. And it centers around the friendship between our main character Gene and his best friend Finney, and the things that happened between them their senior year. For a book that I only barely read 14 years ago, I actually had a pretty good memory of this. A lot of what I said in the intro for it was correct. That said, I did slightly misremember the scene dealing with the stairs. Not going to talk about how or why because that would get into spoilers, but I think I just combined it in my mind with the scene earlier in the book that was dealing with the tree. That said, apart from what I mentioned in the intro, I didn't really remember anything about the plot. So in that way, there were many times that it did feel like I was reading this for the first time because there were huge sections of this book I just had no memory of. I do think I did have a pretty clear memory of like the mood and the vibe and the tone of this book. And in that sense, I think I will personally feel comfortable saying I would put this in the dark academia realm. I also think it exists in that spot where coming of age novels and dark academia overlap, just like I think Dead Poet Society does. This is one of those books that's definitely more character driven, more of a character study than plot driven, and because of that it can sometimes be a little bit meandering in its plot. There were times I enjoyed that aspect of it, times that I didn't. I think mostly I found it charming and I felt like it fit in with that tone of the coming of age dark academia novel. I really wish I remembered what discussions we had around this book in school because I genuinely remember nothing. Apart from the fact that I feel like everyone hated this book and I have no idea why, I feel like if a like 2022 avid reader in high school had to read this for school, I think they might actually enjoy this depending on their taste. On that note, this was written in 1959. There are times it does show its age. In that aspect, it's probably fairly mild for books published at the time that this was published. There are just a few words in here that I would not use. So overall for now, I think I will give this the benefit of the doubt and give it 3.5 out of 5, although I may lower that to 3 out of 5 within the coming days because that's just what I do, I guess. It is time to read We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, and every single time I say that title, I almost say it incorrectly because it is so close to If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio.
I always want to say some weird mashup of the two titles. As I said in the intro, this is the one book in this video that I don't think I will like upon a reread, but I've heard good things about it. It's gotten really popular again because of book talk, and I have a friend who really hypes it up to me. So I'm giving it a second chance. My mind is open. So I read this in 2015 during the Booktubeathon. At the time, I gave it 3.5 stars, which for my rating scale at the time meant that it was all right. As I've established many times in this video, that sentiment currently in my rating scale is like a 2 or a 2.5. However, over the years, my opinion on the book has also gone down, and it now has a 1.5 from me, which is a 1 star on Goodreads. So for my current rating scale, a 1.5 out of 5 just means I didn't like it. I don't have particularly strong feelings toward it. I don't outright hate it. I just didn't like it / dislike it. Most of my negative feelings surrounding this book center around its twist. In fact, after reading this book, I made a whole video talking about why people should not mention that a book has a big plot twist in their review of said book. So I'm already breaking my rule on that by talking about the fact that this book has a plot twist. Regardless, I was told in reviews that this book had like a major plot twist, and I figured out said plot twist about 20 pages into the book. Anytime this happens to me, and it happens fairly frequently, sometimes even on the first page of a book because of how a book is narrated, I have a difficult time enjoying said book. On top of this, from my memory, I didn't think it had much plot. I remember that I thought not much happened in it. I didn't find the characters particularly interesting either. I think I just kind of remember this as being the embodiment of a basic, bland, generic YA novel. The one redeeming factor that I mentioned earlier, which is the main reason that it's even on this list, is the fact that I wonder if I've been too harsh to this book over the years. Have I allowed my negative reading experience to cloud my judgment of the book overall and make it out to be worse than it actually is? So I'm gonna reread it, and I'm gonna give it a second chance, and even though I don't expect to enjoy it this time around, my mind is open, it is willing to be changed. I didn't think that there was anything particularly surprising or groundbreaking about it. I kind of deduced what was going on pretty early in the book, and so I just kind of spent the rest of it confirming what I thought was right and finding proof for it. I didn't think that there was anything particularly special about it. I have very complex feelings about this book, and I'm not sure how to describe them. Was it pretty much exactly what I remembered it being? Yeah. I thought the plot twist was very obvious from pretty early on. Not much happens in this book, there's not much of a plot, but it didn't bother me as much this time because I think that's kind of the point. Most of the characters are unlikable, but they're purposely unlikable, and the ones that aren't totally unlikable are pretty bland and generic. And like I said, it just basically reads like a very bland, generic YA novel, from the romance to the characters to the lack of plot. So everything I said about this earlier and remembered about this was right. However, also a lot of my complaints about this book feel like intentional choices. Characters actively being unlikable, the plot purposely being non-existent and or very slow. So I also feel like I shouldn't / can't complain about those things because like that's the whole point. But I still didn't enjoy those things, and I didn't like the book. And it's not even like I dislike reading about unlikable pretentious characters, because If We Were Villains and The Secret History are two of my favorite books. I think for me it just comes back to the fact that every element of this is so indicative of that generic, basic YA novel that was everywhere in 2015 and that I feel like I've read 1,000 times. So do I ultimately feel like I've been too harsh to this over the years? Yes and no. Like I said, everything about this was pretty much exactly as I remembered, except that I didn't remember a single character's name because none of them are memorable. However, I think because I think of this as like the embodiment of that basic YA novel, I think that I've tended to think of this over the years as a bad book. And that very specific bad description, I think, is probably a bit harsh for this book specifically. In fact, after rereading it, I'm kind of considering, okay, do I maybe bump this up to a 2 out of 5 instead of a 1.5 out of 5? And I'm not sure my opinion really matches either of those ratings perfectly. It's somewhere in the middle. I think ultimately, if I have to land on a certain rating, I would end up going with the 1.5 again, mostly because I do tend to lower ratings over time, which is what happened with this. And I think if I were to give it the benefit of the doubt, give it a 2, say it's okay, I would end up lowering that to the 1.5 again eventually. Because I do tend to be that person who looks at books through rose-colored glasses right after reading them, and then the rose-colored glasses go away after a little period of time. So I think on this one, my rating stands 1.5. I did not like this book, but I don't hate it or anything. I just didn't like it. All right, wrap up time, and I'm gonna try to make this quick because I know this is a long video. So I wish I'd thought to do this before rereading all these books, but I think it'd be cool to do like a ranking comparison before and after, but I do have pre-reread rankings, so I'll go off of those. So this would probably be my pre-reread ranking of these books. A separate piece on the bottom, We Were Liars, Sandman, The Fade Out, Mr. Penumbra, and Lock and Key at the top. And then this would probably be my ranking after rereading them. I would say We Were Liars and Sandman are mostly tied at the bottom, but I think Sandman is really good. I just didn't enjoy it, so I put it above We Were Liars, followed by The Fade Out, Lock and Key, A Separate Piece, and Mr. Penumbra's. So all in all, A Separate Piece moved a lot, but it's pretty similar to the pre-reread ranking. So what have I learned from this experiment? Honestly, not much. Of the 6 books, 4 of them had pretty similar ratings both before and after the reread, whereas A Separate Piece and Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore both had what I would consider a fairly significant change in rating for the positive. A Separate Piece went from 1.5 to 3.5, and Mr. Penumbra's went from 2.5 to 4. So on the whole, there weren't very many huge shifts in opinion like I hoped there might be. So because there wasn't a huge shift in opinion for most of these books, I'm kind of starting to question if I should even still do this series. I'm going to, I plan to, but I'm like, is there even a point? Like, do I really even need to check and see if my favorite books hold up? Because based on this, it seems like they will, because it seems like my opinions don't shift as much as I thought they might. At this point, I'm planning on there being at least 1 more video in the series, possibly 2, but only definitively 2 videos total. As I've mentioned a few times in this video, that next video in the series is going to be me rereading some of my all-time favorite books that I haven't read in a while to see, do they hold up? So as a gift to those of you who stayed through this very long video, which I very much appreciate, I'll give you a little teaser of what books are to come in that video. This list is subject to change, but as of now, these are the books I will be rereading for that video. I'm particularly nervous about City of Bones. Alright, that is it for this video. Thank you again so much for watching this very long video. I very much appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications so you'll be notified when I post it. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books and what you think of them. And links to all my social media, especially Goodreads and Twitter, are down in the description because those are the 2 I'm most active on. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.